very lucky today to have a guest here who is one of the leading scholars on the history of Puritanism, among other topics. This is Dr. Crawford Gribben, who teaches at Queen's University in Belfast, and has previously taught at a number of other major institutions in Great Britain and Ireland. He has published a very impressive roster of books. He published one a couple of years ago called John Owen and English Puritanism, about one of the leading thinkers and writers of that movement. He's written about evangelical millennialism in the transatlantic world. He has one great focus in life, which is the end of the world, about which he is one of our great experts. He wrote a fine book called Writing the Rapture, Prophecy Fiction in Evangelical America. And one thing that's very important about Dr. Gribben's work is how widely he ranges, not just in matters involving Britain and Ireland, but also the North America, and also in time. He does work on the 17th century, the 19th century, very contemporary world. So he's written a large number of books. He's edited a large number of collections, and he really is a flagship scholar in the field. And as I often say, it's one of the great pleasures of being in a group like ISR, Institute for Studies of Religion, that we can bring in people that we really admire and get to hear them. And I was about to give you his talk, which is different from what is showing here, but I'll assume that we are going with that one, and The Devil and Baptist Life Writing in Cromwellian Ireland. Thank you very much, Dr. Gribben.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today, and also to Leonie for all her work in making sure this happened. As you'll see from your brochure, I was going to speak about ghosts, but they disappeared. And so I had to do something instead. It's wonderful to be at Baylor. Not only are you having sunny weather, which we never have in the British Isles, but it's also a great pleasure to meet so many of you over lunch, over coffees, graduate students, colleagues here. It's been wonderful. It's been a very stimulating few days. I've been reading and enjoying the works of several colleagues here for up to 20 years, and that work has really shown me some of the exciting potential that our disciplines, the disciplines that we love, can yield to us, how enriching and stretching some of that work can be. And so I want to say a special thank you to the colleagues who've welcomed me here. I've got a PowerPoint hastily organised this morning, and I'm going to do something which I wouldn't normally do, partly because I'm fighting jet lag to some extent. I'm going to be using a written paper in a way that I wouldn't normally use a written paper, so I hope you'll bear with me as I do that. This is a picture of the place where I work in Belfast. Thanks to Photoshop, we've got a blue sky. And you'll notice the green there is just a little bit too lurid to be real. I think this has been probably quite artfully touched up, but at least that's the shape of the building. There's a recent biography of John Owen. I edit a couple of series, one of them on Scottish religious cultures for Edinburgh University Press, another for Palgrave Macmillan called Christianities in the Transatlantic World. This is an interesting book on the subject of Puritanism and emotion in the early modern world, edited by Alec Ryrie and Tom Schwanda, and this is a spare copy. So if one of the graduate students would like it, please just do come and take that at the end. Right, this is what we're going to be talking about today. Here's a rough summary of it. So I'll read you through this now, and if you happen to doze off at any point, you can wake up and still have a rough idea of where we're going, and most importantly of all, when it might end. So, the Devil and Baptist Life Writing in Cromwellian Ireland. The Baptist movement in Cromwellian Ireland displayed a number of distinctive features. Let me just backtrack a little bit, because Philip explained very helpfully something of the background to this specific decade which is a most unusual decade in the history of the island of Ireland. In the 1610s and 20s, there was a plantation, a sequence of plantations of the Protestant populations of southwest Scotland and northern England into areas in the northeast of Ireland and in the southwest of Ireland. In 1641, there was a brutal, bloody rebellion which very quickly descended into a sectarian effort at genocide directed by the native Irish population against the planters. Historians debate the number of people who died in that rebellion. At the time, people like Baxter actually and John Milton were circulating figures as high as 300,000 Protestant deaths. Now, we know that's a phenomenally inflated figure because there were only 40,000 settlers as far as we can work out. But by cross-referencing various accounts and lots of depositions, survivor statements, we estimate around about 12,000 people. So approximately 20%, 25% of the Protestant planter population was killed in some incredibly brutal months of what's effectively religious terror. That rebellion in 1641 became the justification, as Philip just mentioned, for the reconquest of Ireland, led by Oliver Cromwell, bringing a phenomenally large army of around 30,000 soldiers across from Chester into Dublin in August 1649, beginning and achieving in 3 years what no other English administration had ever been able to achieve in the island of Ireland, which was to achieve complete control by a single English government of the entire island. That in turn led to another phase of brutal total war. We saw just now the map which showed the massive land confiscations. The 60% of land that belonged to Irish Catholics in 1649 was reduced to less than 20% 11 years later. The genocide, the sectarian genocide attempted in 1641 was matched by efforts at ethnic cleansing in the 1650s. And in the 1650s, it was the turn of English Protestants to attempt to sweep Irish Catholics beyond the Shannon into Connacht, the most desolate and agriculturally challenged of the Irish provinces. And so I'm going to tell a few more ghost stories and explore hopefully some similar themes to what we've just been thinking about. And as I do so, I'd like you to think about the very specific context of Cromwellian Ireland. It's a period that's been ravaged by civil war, but this civil war has also destroyed the social fabric of this country. There's disease, poverty, there's famine, there is consequently, with mass death, a very imminent sense of apocalypse. And as the apocalypse becomes ever more imminent, so the dynamic and dramatic manifestations of maleficent spiritual beings become ever more intense. And that's what some of the stories I'm going to talk about today are going to show. And so I'm going to begin in the late 1650s with an individual called Jerome Sankey. In Dublin, sometime in the late 1650s, Jerome Sankey attempted an exorcism. Sankey had arrived in the city as a soldier in the early part of the decade with the Cromwellian invasion. The Act for the Better Advancement for the Gospel and Learning in Ireland, which was passed by the London Parliament in 1650, had listed Sankey with John Owen, Henry Ireton and Henry Cromwell, respectively Cromwell's son and son-in-law, in a committee that was tasked to oversee the properties of the Archbishop of Dublin and also the Dean and Chapter of St Patrick's Cathedral. It's not clear how Sankey had come to the attention of London MPs, but the career that they facilitated was certainly eventful. Sankey was a field officer of some note. In August 1652, he had received the surrender of Richard Grace, the last Irish commander of any importance to submit to the parliamentary army. But Sankey was also a minister, and according to Sir William Petty, whose portrait you see on the slide, Sankey ever loved to be heard publicly as a preacher. Like many of his peers, Sankey joined the controversy against the Baptists, until, upon the very edge of his railing against it, he was convinced by Thomas Patient, a Baptist preacher, that the faith of his parents could not make Sankey's infant washing effectual. Now associated with the Baptists, Sankey positioned himself at the centre of a web of religious and political conspiracy. It's not clear when he was baptised by Sankey, by Patient, but it's evident that he did not understand this baptism as representing a binding commitment to a new religious community, nor whether in fact he was ever a member of a Baptist congregation. Sir William Petty noted that a little after he turned Baptist, Sankey offended the anti-ceremonial sensibilities of his co-religionists. He did, Petty reported, to the offence of his church, appear in scarlet, in robes of scarlet, dressed like a doctor at Dublin, that he was busy in the most superstitious ceremonies performed at the instalment of a university chancellor, sticking at nothing that might make him, or at least make him seem to be something. And the Baptist community had further cause for complaint against Sankey. While Sankey found himself as a trustee of Trinity College Dublin, as then the governor of Clonmel in Tipperary, and as a representative to the Irish Council of the Samuel Hartlib Circle, he also became involved in Dublin Presbyterian politics and was nominated as a church warden, a position associated with the old established church. He received a knighthood from Richard Cromwell, no friend of the Baptists, in 1658. As his career advanced, Sankey lost many friends. But of all of his spectacular falls from grace, it was his attempt at exorcisms that generated his greatest notoriety. Of course, when we read about these exorcisms, we've got to read them with caution. We find out about Sankey's attempts at exorcisms through a publication prepared by Sir William Petty, the Cromwellian administrator, natural philosopher, and founder of the Royal Society. His book appeared in 1660, as its author, Petty, was negotiating the very dangerous circumstances of the Restoration. Petty's work reeked with hostility to Sankey. The animosity may have been personal. Sankey had attempted to have Petty impeached in Parliament in 1659. Petty's animosity to Sankey might also have been a strategy to distance himself in a very political way from the extravagances of the revolutionary period, paving the way for what turned out to be his very successful rehabilitation and almost immediate knighthood under the new restored king. But whatever his motivations, Petty reported Sankey's attempt at exorcism, as he said, a most true story, whereof there are many witnesses, and such who have often refreshed their memories concerning the matter by the entertainments they have made to their friends with it. Petty explained that Sankey had a history of dealing with the supernatural, and that he had often heard Sankey report the success of his dealings against a walking spirit named Tuggin. Spooky name, Tuggin. This was satire, rather than an account of spiritual warfare, and Petty's story worked to associate Sankey with all manner of religious and also gastronomic excess. Petty tells another story. Sankey visits a Mr. Wadman, being in a fit of melancholy, reflecting upon the death of his wife, and taking notice of some odd expressions, did by and by fancy that the said Wadman was possessed, that is, to speak in the language of Sir Jerome's order, enchanted. So, Sankey attempted the exorcism, and as it continued, would occasionally ask Mr. Wadman how he did. Wadman always answered with a sign, all one, no change. So Sankey grew weary of his attempts at exorcism, and concluded that Wadman's devil was of that sort that required fasting as well as prayer to expel it, whereupon the spectators, observing how plentifully Sir Jerome had eaten and tippled that evening, did easily conceive the cause why the devil did not stir. Sankey later returned, having made the appropriate precautions, but found the devil departed, Mr. Wadman having been let blood in the meantime. Petty, who was something of a free thinker, dismiss Sankey's claims about this experience as nothing more than the blundering of a man on the make. His conclusion: is there anything more abominable than those that make religion a trade, living only upon their turning and winding with this and the other church? Do you think there are not swarms of such? Petty complained. Sankey was among these religiously orientated careerists, Petty feared, and he pointed to the competition between new religious movements to explain the precarious nature of the Irish Protestant churches. I say, he continued, that the melancholy, jealous, discontented, and active spirits, common to all sectaries, hath been the reason why those in Ireland do as well find fault with the administration of the survey as the sacraments, and with the distributing of land as well as dividing the word. So Petty was representing Sankey's exorcisms as illustrating how the new Protestant control of Ireland, made possible by the schemes for ethnic cleansing and land distribution that he himself had facilitated, was now being threatened by cantankerous and unpredictable extremists. The gains of the Cromwellian invasion, the total subjugation of Ireland to English politics, was being threatened by a bizarre consequence of the democratisation of Puritanism in Ireland's new religious marketplace. In the presentation today, I want to argue that Petty's conclusion was in one sense correct, that Sankey's efforts at exorcism did reflect some of the very distinctive features of Irish Cromwellian religion, and particularly the expectations for spiritual experience that were encouraged but never successfully contained by leaders within the Irish Baptist movement. In fact, I want to argue that the unusual spiritual experiences reported by Irish Baptists were more distinctive of their geographical and political context than of their denominational affiliation. Even John Bunyan's experience, described in Grace Abounding 1666, an experience that led his biographer Richard Greaves to analyse his pathology and to attempt a diagnosis, even that vivid experience was not as vivid as that recorded by some Irish Baptists. Bunyan, in Grace Abounding, seems to experience Satan's temptations in his conscience and to hear the voice of God coming through Scripture. But the Irish Baptists who write about spiritual experience in this period record voices of supernatural beings that were audible and unmediated. And so, very much like other Irish Cromwellians, but much less like Baptists elsewhere, Irish Baptists claimed heightened spiritual experiences, which in a number of cases included first-hand encounters with a devil they could see and smell. This presentation describes several of these cases and considers attempts within this community to promote appropriate claims to spiritual experience while countering illegitimate claims to spiritual experience, to sustain but also to contain expectations of spiritual experience in Cromwellian Ireland. Irish Cromwellians believed that they lived in an enchanted world in which believers could experience what the Limerick Presbyterian minister Claudius Gilbert described as the tragedy of hell let loose. Gilbert's comment drew upon the intensely supernatural language that had been developed to describe English Protestant perceptions of Ireland and the Irish. In 1581, the English administrator John Derrick initiated this tradition in his book The Image of Ireland. He described the Irish as monsters. His book The Image of Ireland is illustrated with some very compelling woodcuts. If you look at them on the internet, you'll see in much better detail than I can show you just now some of the extraordinary references, visual references, that these woodcuts contain. These woodcuts have to be read in serial fashion. They have an ABC sequence. You'll see over here a tonsured individual, a cleric or a monk perhaps, offering a blessing to some kind of chieftain who leads his band into warfare, who catches one of their enemies. As you'll see, the enemies are being beheaded. These are very familiar visual cues in our modern media culture. They are also very common early modern visual cues. But you'll find images like the image of this man. Can you see this man's face? Can you see his hairstyle, which is completely different from the hairstyles around him? When I show this to my students back in Belfast, I ask them to tell me which Star Wars character this reminds them of. And they all say Darth Maul. What's the image reference here? It's demonic, it's scary. It's a demon fighting with the Irish against the English. And so Derek, as he produces these incredible woodcuts and writes poetry to go alongside them, emphasises that the Irish are monsters. Edmund Spenser wrote his view of the present state of Ireland in 1598, only gets published around 1633, but Spenser builds in this tradition to describe in Ireland the existence of werewolves and cannibals. The survivor statements from those who endured the 1641 rebellion refer to multiple instances of cannibalism, alongside horrific accounts of mass death. The survivor accounts of 1641 repeatedly refer to the appearances of ghosts that cry out for revenge at the sites of mass murder. And we know from the life writing of some of the Baptists in Cromwellian Ireland that many of the men in that community had served in the army through this period. Some of them reported their own escapes from exactly the kinds of circumstances that had produced the ghosts that haunted the Protestant imagination in and after the Cromwellian invasion of Ireland. And so in the 1640s, the trauma experienced by survivors of this rebellion confirmed not only the existence of cannibals and werewolves and ghosts, but they confirmed the emergence of a tradition of writing about the supernatural, a tradition that may in some ways mark the origin point of the Irish Gothic, a moment that contributors to the Irish Gothic repeatedly refer to: Sheridan Le Fanu, Bram Stoker, and of course Elizabeth Bowen, that we just thought about in terms of Bowen's Court. Well, this practice of writing about the supernatural intensified in the next decade after the Cromwellian invasion in the 1650s. With the experiences of the native Irish being lost in part to history, thanks to the massive confiscations of land and population movements, and thanks also to the destruction of public records in the last of the Irish Civil Wars in the 1920s, the literary artefacts associated with the invading army suggest that the winners, as well as the losers in the Cromwellian campaign, were profoundly affected by these circumstances of loss, displacement and death. John Owen, who accompanied Cromwell's forces as Cromwell's chaplain, was horrified during the 9 months he spent in Dublin by poor parentless children that lie begging, starving, rotting in the streets and find no relief. He was appalled by charismatic preachers who stood in the same streets to proclaim themselves to be God with detestable pride, atheism and folly. And other ministers recording the events within this war-zone capital recorded similar kinds of instances. Members of the Open Baptist congregation that met in Christchurch Cathedral, led by John Rogers, the author of O Hela B'Shemish, Tabernacle for the Sun, recorded being assaulted by demons and hearing audible voices from heaven. They noted the effect of Owen's careful but powerful preaching, alongside the preaching of a boy whose declamations and exhortations made a considerable impression in the city. And the effect of this religious chaos and the spiritual uncertainties it brought with it were felt far outside the Irish capital. In Cork in 1652, Walter Costello discovered an angel at the bottom of his bed, which commissioned the prophecy that he published in 1655 under the title Charles Stuart and Oliver Cromwell Reunited. Turned out not to be a bestseller. While in 1655, as we just heard, a soldier in Ireland, Henry Bowen, who's been court-martialed for heresy, investigated reports made by his Baptist wife that his own ghost had appeared in his family home in Wales. In fact, this predilection for the exotic and unusual was so extreme that in one instance, a regiment of Cromwellian soldiers could only persuade their captain that it was time to move on to a new location by waiting until he was asleep, by fixing a pipe under his bed, and from the outside of his tent, speaking through that pipe in a booming voice that persuaded their captain that he too was hearing the voice of God. Well, at the same time, the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland provided a new context for the long-standing debate among Protestant theologians as to the nature of true spirituality and as to its relationship to baptism. This debate indicated the extent to which Puritan cultures associated spirituality and sacraments, for the quest to define the primitive doctrine of baptism was inevitably related to discussion of the spiritual condition and experiences of its proper candidates. Of course, Puritan preachers with widely varying ecclesiastical convictions were strongly conversionistic and agreed that a merely formal commitment to orthodox theology, which they often described as historical faith, brought no promise of salvation. But Baptists focused particularly on this issue, for they were compelled to judge the spiritual qualifications of applicants for baptism. And because their ecclesiological ambitions for a pure communion tended not to be satisfied with the assertions of doctrinal orthodoxy and the evidences of moral living that were the requirements of their principal alternatives in the religious mainstream. Richard Lawrence, later a leading figure among Baptists in Ireland, epitomised the concerns of many Puritans when he worried about those who thought, when they'd attempt to read and say their catechism, creed and Lord's Prayer by heart, that they were Christians good enough because it was all their parsons were able to teach them. Doctrinal tests could measure an individual's ability to capture patterns of knowledge. But only an assessment of an individual's spirituality could provide evidence that they were among the elect, or so the logic went. But the conclusion became problematic, because across the theological spectrum, and within these emerging denominational communities, Puritans could not agree on how true spirituality could be detected, of what true spirituality should be composed, nor of how true spirituality should be related to baptism. And their arguments took them ever further from the Reformed theological tradition from which their movement had emerged. Particular Baptists were among those most concerned with the debate about spirituality and its relationship to sacraments. From the beginning of the mid-17th century crisis, the particular Baptist churches, that section of the English Baptist movement that most closely identified with Calvinistic theology, had been advancing on the basis of a confession of faith, first published in 3 editions in 1644 and reprinted with minor variations in 46, 51, 52 and 53. With its focus on dogmatic axioms, this confession of faith gave little guidance as to the nature of spiritual experience, though later editions did take account of the threat of the Quaker menace and more carefully delineated their notion of spirituality from that of their principal alternatives. Those editions of the Confession published in the 1650s included a substantial appendix entitled Heart Bleedings for Professors' Abominations. This text, which claimed to come from the same churches that had published the Confession in London, was prepared by a number of Baptist leaders, including William Kiffin, one of the most influential London preachers, and Thomas Patient, who became the principal leader of the movement in Ireland. Heart Bleedings addressed the changing spiritual environment in which particular Baptist theology was being refined. Its authors noted that some of the more radical enemies of the particular Baptist cause were now advancing a spirituality that was quite alternative to that of more orthodox divines. These preachers, they continued, were labouring to beget in the people's minds a contempt and slight esteem of Christ, his word, and ordinances, emphasising, as we just heard, a God within, a Christ within, and a word within, all characteristic features of the emerging Quaker discourse. But the effect of this preaching was that with great and swelling words of vanity, the Quakers could triumph in a great mystery of mere nothing but emptiness and confusion, speaking things whereof they know not. And many poor souls, knowing such expressions to be scripture phrases, do greedily embrace them, without a true, distinct, and clear understanding of the sense of what is spoken, having the persons of those who speak such language in great admiration as the chief, tender, charitable, knowing, high, and spiritual Christians. The problem was very real. If spirituality can only be measured through rhetoric, if, as in these churches, it was the performance of a conversion narrative that authenticated your claim to true faith, didn't that simply make spirituality a rhetorical construct? How could these Puritan congregations, so focused on identifying what was true and real, see through or even beyond the words that were communicating these ideas to authenticate something that lay behind them? And so the people who wrote this appendix to the Baptist Confession in the 1650s worried that these supposedly high and spiritual Christians were actually guilty of drunkenness, cursing, swearing, or whoredom. They feared that they were violently hurried on through strong imputations and restless suggestions and instigations of the devil. The authors were concerned that these Quakers were encouraging others to leave the holy word of God and give heed to the motions of a deceitful heart, to the dictates of a lying spirit. But the Baptist leaders asserted that for the most part, those who had fallen into these abominations were not members of Baptist congregations, as their enemies had charged, for, the logic went, those who had been truly regenerated and added to a Baptist congregation simply could not turn aside from the voice of the true shepherd to follow strangers and the cunning sleights and devices of the destroyer that walks up and down as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour, who has cast down many wounded and many strong men. The Baptist authors, the leading Baptist theologians in Ireland and England, were arguing, or assuming, it was not normally possible for unregenerate people to be admitted into membership of Baptist churches, and therefore that members of these churches would not ordinarily fall prey to Quaker deceit and the satanic impulses that the Quakers represented. And all of this despite the claims of individuals like Lawrence Clarkson, later a leading ranter theologian, to have shared fellowship with people who had been part of Thomas Patient's congregation in London en route to their much more radical spiritual conclusion. Baptist leaders defended their movement by arguing that its theology sustained and contained a robust spirituality which responded to Christ's voice by emphasising objective over subjective knowledge claims, which was grounded in and limited by its dependence upon Scripture alone. Emphasising this containment of spiritual experience, their confession of faith, like other Puritan confessions, included little of the warm, elevated and devotional language that occasionally marks some other creedal statements of the period, such as a Confession of Faith of the Holy Separated Church of God, 1645, which acknowledged alongside its doctrinal claims that the sweetest thing is Christ's name and presence. This silence as to the nature of true spirituality, or what might be expected of spiritual experience, was to become a structural weakness in the advance of the Baptist movement, as members of the movement articulated claims to spiritual experience that elevated subjective over objective knowledge claims, and in which individual, unusual spiritual experiences could be sustained without being contained. For even as their leaders did debate how to contain expectations of the unusual, individual members of Baptist congregations rejected that advice and wondered whether the dangers of satanic deception were more than a literary trope in a genre of conversion narrative that was becoming ever contested as evidence of the work of God in an age of rhetorical reproduction. the democratization of Puritanism encouraged an ecstatic, even charismatic spirituality, as members of the Irish Baptist community worked out their own salvation while resisting, or perhaps while simply not enjoying, the guidance of their leaders. Well, of course, this is in part an argument from silence, for the general lack of documentary evidence from this period turns many exercises in Irish religious history in the early modern period into some species of educated guesswork. But it does seem to be the case that Irish Baptists, who in this period shared the leadership and textual culture of the English Baptist movement, took advantage of this failure to define what might be expected in spiritual experience, to permit enormous variations within the boundaries of their community. In Cromwellian Ireland, Baptist life took on a distinctive localised form, which can be distinguished from the English movement. The movements were distinguished politically, for English Baptists wrote formally to their Irish co-religionists to warn them against their anti-Cromwellian outbursts. They were also distinguished ecclesiologically, because English Baptists were decidedly concerned by the failure of their Irish brethren to properly distinguish the holders of pastoral office. And similarly, while the Baptist movement in Ireland appears to have been much more consistently Calvinist than its counterpart in England, it was also more variegated in terms of its expectations of spiritual experience. Many of its adherents embraced the spiritual and political possibilities of the revolutionary period, and were simultaneously embraced by exponents of even more radical religious preferences. The library of one of the major planters in the Midlands of Ireland, Benjamin Worsley, a spiritual entrepreneur whose experiments in alchemy helped him to discover the secret of immortality. It's true. This is true. Contained in his library books by Thomas Patient, the Irish Baptist leader. The Irish Baptist movement may have been more theologically consistent than its English counterpart, but it permitted, or at least failed to control, a much broader range of spiritual experience. How are we doing for time, Philip? Are we okay? I want to speak for a while then about Thomas Patient. Got 2 more hours to go. Relax. I want to speak for a while about Thomas Patient because among Irish Baptists, Thomas Patient was the most important theorist of conversion, spirituality, and its relationship to baptism. He wrote one book in 1654 about baptism, which reflected upon the spiritual joys and duties of Christians. The horrific civil wars of the previous years had encouraged his conviction that there was only a small moment of time from the Lord allotted to men in this life, and there was, he felt, no time for delay. His vision of the godly life was purposeful and activist, and it drew upon the experiences he recorded in his own conversion narrative. His spiritual biography advanced beyond the generically standardised accounts of conversion that typified a series of publications that had come out in the previous year, in 1653, among them John Rogers' book, O Helen Bashemish, that I just showed you a couple of slides ago. But Patient's conversion narrative, contained in his book about baptism in 1654, reflected his fear that the new morphology of Puritan conversion was rhetorically reproducible, that it was only a matter of verbal performance. Patient's account described the beginnings of his own spiritual life, but advanced beyond his own conversion and his pursuit of assurance of faith to address the means by which he'd arrived at specifically Baptist conclusions. Lots of this is familiar enough to readers of 17th century conversion narratives. We know little about Patient's background. Probably wasn't a university graduate, because his opponents described him as being no more than a glover or a tailor. As to his conversion, he simply explained that it pleased God to reveal his Son in me and to work a change in my heart, and that thereafter the great and mighty thing that God presented to me was to make my calling and election sure, which I found to be a work filled with many difficulties, considering how far hypocrites may attain in the profession of godliness, and that they might come to have the counterfeit of all the grace in the child of God. And so he continued. This the rather appeared more difficult, he said, because I found my own heart so desperately wicked and full of deceit, and also found the wiles and subtleties of the devil to be various. I considered under several temptations and deep desertions, when God, though for a little season, withdrew himself and the light of his countenance from me. At which time I judged it the only thing necessary to prove whether Christ were in me, and my faith right, as also my sincerity in the Lord. At which time I found but little settled rest or peace, till the Lord had put that great question out of doubt, in giving me a sure and well-grounded confidence of my interest in him, till which time I found little disposition to search narrowly into other truths, searching out the difference betwixt the speaking of God's Spirit, my own spirit, and the spirit of Satan. This marks a critical moment in Patient's conversion narrative, the moment when he feels his assurance of salvation is real, and when he feels more confident in his ability to distinguish the speaking of God's Spirit, my own spirit, and the spirit of Satan. And so it's after this, as he becomes assured of his own salvation, that Patient becomes interested in this question of baptism, and makes this slow progress through a time in New England, out in the woods on his own, communing with God, reading his Bible, counting the cost of becoming a Baptist in a situation in which that would lead inevitably to exile, if not imprisonment. And so, out in the woods, among the Indians and wild beasts, as he describes it, he turns to prayer. Hereupon I found the special presence of God with me, he explained, carrying out my heart to the Lord by faith and earnest prayer, until at last it pleased the Lord to reveal his mind to me. The Lord breaking in with not only a clear light in me as to the matter in question, but 3 days one after another, coming into my soul with sealing manifestations of love, and that with scriptures so pertinent and suitable to my condition. Patient studies the Bible, he prays, and out in the woods, with the dangers that he associates with the New England wilderness, he has an unusual spiritual experience that confirms to him that his reading of Scripture is correct, and that believers' baptism is the proper method of observing the Lord's command. Patient was right. He was going to be criminalised for his new belief. A warrant for his arrest was issued on the 23rd of June 1643, but by that point Patient had already fled across the Atlantic, heading back to England. Back in London, Thomas Patient soon arose to a position of leadership and influence. He was ordained, one of Philip's theological complainers complained, he was ordained in a house in Bell Alley in Coleman Street, the street that represented everything that was wrong with London religion in the 1640s. Milton just lived round the corner. By the saints, forsooth, of the church, men and women alike, the Presbyterian complained, upon trial of his gifts, ordained Thomas Patient. In 1648, Patient was described as a tailor in Southwark, who preaches out of a window in Bell Alley in Coleman Street, and his congregation was being spied upon in Skippin's secret listing of schismatics in the city. This is a man who's at the centre of a lot of conspiracy and a lot of observation. In London, Patient quickly joined the congregation led by William Kiffin, and was one of a handful of community leaders to sign the first and second editions of the Confession of Faith produced by the 7 particular Baptist churches in London in 1644. Patient may have been one of the 6 preachers selected by Parliament to travel to Ireland in March 1649 on what was then the remarkable salary of £200. Most likely before his departure, Patient found time to complete with other Baptist leaders a preface to a book called A Way to Zion, published in 1650, which drew heavily on the language of the Baptist Confession of Faith, while grimly confronting the threats of the new and hyper radicalised spirituality. Patient and the other Baptists worried that, as they put it, the devil has mustered up all his forces of late to blind and pester the minds of good people, to keep them from the clear knowledge and practice of the way of God, either persuading people that there are no churches in the world and that persons cannot come to the practice of ordinances, there being no true ministry, or, alternatively, by arguing that Christ is a shadow and all his gospel and ordinances, like himself, fleshly and carnal. Moving to Ireland, Patient began a preaching ministry in Kilkenny, Waterford, and eventually Dublin, where he was appointed chaplain to John Jones, one of the 4 parliamentary commissioners responsible for the governance of the island, where he replaced a state preacher, Samuel Winter, a conservative congregational pastor who was a conservative advocate of extraordinary revelation. His book records encounters with angels, mystical lights that shine in the congregation to pinpoint individuals who need special counsel at special times. But Winter was replaced by Patient, promoting a more objective and bibliocentric spirituality than either Winter or the Quakers had done, and pushing a much more consistent and radical ecclesiological agenda. Patient established the first Baptist congregation in Ireland, in Swift's Alley in Dublin, in 1653. Around the same time, there was arguments in favour of closed communion, that baptised people should only break bread with other baptised people, shattered the unity of the congregation led by John Rogers, whose book we saw a couple of slides ago. In the same year, Patient and the new Baptists in Dublin were stoned. 1 year later, he published his book, the first substantial defence of the particular Baptist position, in 1654. Patient was worried about writing. He was worried about the world being filled with books stuffed with man's wisdom. He was worried that the effect of Puritan writing was to give people shortcuts to declarations as to spiritual experience. In his own writing about his own spiritual experience, he was hesitant to describe the details of his experience. More often he quoted biblical language to describe an experience he did not want himself to define. He's worried that the remarkable work of God in conversion and in providing assurance can be so easily described that anyone can begin to narrate the same kind of experience and enter the privileges of Baptist church life. And so, Patient's work is always to argue that the subjective should be controlled by the objective, that there is place for true spiritual experience in these Baptist churches, that Baptist theology and Baptist spirituality should sustain spiritual experience, but that Baptist spirituality should be contained by the objective statements of what Scripture will warrant and support. The problem is that Patient was doing all of this while also admitting in his book that he had come to his faith as a Baptist by an unusual experience in the woods somewhere in New England. Patient thought that he had found a way to distinguish the speaking of God's Spirit, my own spirit, and the spirit of Satan. But his conclusion was ambiguous. For the spirit of Satan was active, he feared. Patient was very concerned by the arguments of those who believed that extraordinary spiritual experiences elevated them above the need for baptism. He argued that the baptism of the Holy Spirit actually compelled people towards water baptism, that true spirituality would drive people into the folds of this new religious movement that he wanted to lead. Of course, Patient's polemic drew criticism. He failed to hold his new congregation together. Its numerical losses were being reported in April 1654, and so he decided to leave pastoral ministry to take up the role of travelling evangelist for the Baptist cause. He was still attracting the attention of leaders of the Cromwellian administration in Ireland. In 1655, a correspondent informed Henry Cromwell, the Irish deputy, that Patient had a great measure of faith and great expressions. In other words, that he was a great talker a great talker about religious themes. But it was evident that the increasingly conservative ethos of the Irish government found less that was attractive in Patient's style of theological polemic. There was only one book-length response to Thomas Patient's defence of baptism. It was produced by a Presbyterian theologian called Edward Warren. Warren was worried that the Irish Baptists, being led by Patient, were preaching not conversion but subversion, and it's clear that others were beginning to share his view. For as they worried about the true nature of spiritual experience, and as they cast the emergence of the new Baptist movement as an example of the work of the Spirit of God in an island subjugated by demons and by the influence of Satan, Thomas Patient and the Baptists he led were challenging not only the conservative trend in Irish Cromwellian politics, but also in its religion. I want to speak for a second now about Deborah Huish. Edward Warren, writing about Thomas Patient, had good cause to be worried about the health of the Irish Baptist churches, because even as Thomas Patient, their leader, was trying to counsel distressed souls, Irish Baptists were facilitating a culture of celebrity around some of their most tormented adherents. Between 1654 and 57, Thomas Patient was involved in the strange case of Deborah Huish, the daughter of a Devonshire gentry family whose sisters had married two particular Baptists and leading lights of the Fifth Monarchist movement, William Allen and John Vernon. Deborah Huish had accompanied Vernon on an extended visit to Ireland, a visit of 3 years, during which he hoped to promote Baptist beliefs. Huish's spiritual troubles had begun some 14 years previously, when she was in her early teens, when she was cast into very deep despair and found herself subjected to blasphemous thoughts. Her sister, who by this stage had married John Vernon, the particular Baptist leader, endeavoured to persuade me, Huish said, that these thoughts were not mine, but the devil's. And this gave me some respite for a while, but I was suddenly assaulted again. Huish's experiences moved from the mediated communications with spiritual beings, the mediated experience that's reported by Bunyan, writing about his own experiences in 53 and 54, to something much more vivid and immediate. And these assaults escalated after her removal to Ireland in June 1654, when she was suddenly after assaulted with more and worse blasphemous thoughts than ever before, and then did verily believe I was possessed by the devil, and did think I talked with him, and hear him say that God loved to torment and bring misery upon his creatures. These anxieties reflected her fear that she had committed the unforgivable sin. This put me into inexpressible torments night and day, thinking the devil would come and fetch me away, and I believed I was certain of it, she wrote. Huish found her new surroundings to be semiotically oppressive. Almost everything did affright me, she said. Either a cloudy day, the sun or moon eclipsed, or the sun's rising red in the morning, or the wind blowing high. All these I thought were signs of my destruction. And like so many other conversion narratives, Huish's narrative wished many times I'd never been born, or else I'd been made the most contemptible person in the world, because when they die, there's an end of them. Well, Huish was visited by Thomas Patient, who warned her of the great danger of an impenitent state if the Lord should cut the thread of my life, that such persons drop immediately into hell, the which he endeavoured to demonstrate to me, that I thought he would be the principal witness against me of all that he had spoken. Then, on a reciprocal visit in Thomas Patient's house, where some Baptist women had met to pray for Huish, she began to smell brimstone and expected nothing but destruction. And she continued, I have oft, as I have judged, seen Michael's meeting house in Dublin, St. Michael's Church in Dublin, where we met to hear, full of smoke. all which I judged sealed and confirmed my destruction. Seeing a red sun, she thought she saw a sign of the apocalypse. Leaving these semiotically oppressive lodgings, she went to stay with William Allen, her brother-in-law, hoping for respite. In the night season, sleeping, she heard a voice, as I judged, over my head, a great voice, to which I hearkened, and was thereby put into a great horror, thinking it to be the devil come to fetch me away. Her hosts made repeated attempts to disenchant her fears. Huish says, I spoke to Mistress Rowe, who told me it was just the people that lay over my head that talked. I didn't believe her. Towards morning I heard a rattling of chains, as I thought, which I judged to be the devil's hastening to fetch me away. But Mistress Rowe, the landlady, told me it's only people opening shop windows. But that satisfied not me. I remained in inexpressible horror. Well, by autumn 1657, after an agonising 3 years of spiritual torment, Huish had returned to her family home in Devonshire, found deliverance from these fears, been assured of her salvation, and been baptised. And it was after 1657 her two brothers-in-law worked to promote her conversion narrative. William Allen recorded her testimony, which he heard, as he said, from her own mouth several times by myself, and which he invested with distinctive political goals, reflecting his commitment to the radical Republican millennial movement known as the Fifth Monarchists. But John Vernon, her other brother-in-law, had different priorities. His priorities were pastoral, because he remembered that many Irish Baptists knew about Deborah Huish, that she was this ironic celebrity of the success and power, the compelling persuasive potential of Irish Baptist rhetoric. He remembered many of the poor mourning saints in Ireland who've often heard from her, and hoped that her narrative of oppression and then deliverance would encourage their dejected souls. Huish's conversion involved breaking the hands of Satan, reclaiming, as the title of her book put it, in an allusion to Isaiah chapter 49, prey from the captive, and established, not least in her reference to the inexpressible horror of satanic deception, some of the central tropes of the Irish Gothic sublime as that would develop in the 18th and later centuries. Other Irish Baptists found this hyper-spirituality pushing them into new religious communities. Lucretia Cook, the wife of Colonel Cook, a member of the church in Bandon, County Cork, gave up on her Baptist ideals and was expelled from her fellowship on the charge of heresy. As a convert to the Quakers, she confronted her former pastor and burned all her religious books in the town square. Especially in the early years of the Cromwellian period, the Quaker threat loomed over Baptist advances as the language of polemic highlighted not just the movement's differences, but these two movements' similarities. Ted Underwood has argued that throughout this period, Baptists advocated the Bible as the rule and touchstone while admitting their need for assistance from the Spirit, whereas Quakers advocated the Spirit to be their guide, but found it necessary to appeal to Scripture to do so. And as Geoffrey Nuttall has noted in his magisterial book, The Holy Spirit in Puritan Faith and Experience, published in 1946, it was always dangerous to be on the side of that argument that emphasised the Bible over subjective experience. Like other groups in Cromwellian Ireland, but not like Baptist movements elsewhere, Irish Baptists sustained but struggled to contain these claims to extraordinary spiritual experience. Of course, the struggle was ultimately unsuccessful. The ideological faltering of the Irish Baptist movement can be clearly traced in the aftermath of the Restoration, when the Republic ended and when King Charles came back to take power in 1660. By the end of the 1650s, it had become clear that some Irish Baptists, like Richard Lawrence, were promoting Puritan spirituality entirely devoid of any Baptistic ecclesiological claim. Baptists who remained interested in spiritual experience in the movement declined in number. Thomas Riggs, the son of the founder of Cork Baptist Church, was arrested in Drogheda in 1712 after having become a follower of the controversial mysticism of the French prophets. Those who remained within the movement were inevitably affected by its theological decline. Oswald Edwards' preaching, tinged with Arminianism, Socinianism, and foul language. I know you're all thinking of corresponding preachers here as I describe this to you. So reduced a major Dublin congregation that one pew could hold all of its members, which reduction in numbers drove Oswald Edwards to raise finance for a church building by the only rational means, by entering a lottery. By the early 18th century, Irish Baptists were still struggling to balance objective and subjective claims to spiritual experience, but now in a declining religious community. In Cromwellian Ireland, Baptists struggled to link their distinctive sacramental practice to a spirituality they could not consistently define. As their leaders feared, in heart's bleedings, many Baptists turned aside from the voice of the true shepherd to follow strangers. Many Baptists fell prey to the cunning sleights and devices of the destroyer that walks up and down as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. For some of the members of the Baptist movement, this reference to spiritual warfare was more than a literary trope expressing the inexpressible horror of the anxiety created by Calvinist theories of conversion. Thomas Patient elevated objective above subjective foundations for knowledge and emphasised the priority of Scripture and the Baptist confessional tradition, even as he admitted that his conversion to the new religious movement was driven by an unusual spiritual experience. Deborah Huish advanced upon Patient's ideas about the influence of Satan to position herself as an exemplary victim of his wiles, as prey that could only be delivered from the captor after the conclusion of her 3 years among the Irish Baptists. And at the end of the decade, Jerome Sankey's attempts at exorcism subverted the inexpressible horror of Huish's spiritual warfare to position Baptist experientialism as the foil, the perfect foil, to the careful and mathematical precision preferred by Sir William Petty's Geographical Survey, with all of its significance as the foundation for the security of Ireland's new landed Protestant establishment. Jerome Sankey, attempting his exorcisms, may have been doing something unusual from an English Baptist perspective. But this manifestation of the struggle against Satan was a logical consequence of the rhetoric of Irish Baptist spirituality and the apocalyptic mindset they shared with many of the period and region's others new religious movements. For as Irish Baptists struggled to balance objective and subjective spiritual claims, to sustain and contain expectations of spiritual experience, they became much less representative of their co-religionists across the three nations, and much more representative of the chaos and competition of the democratisation of Puritanism in the religious marketplace of Cromwellian Ireland. Thanks very much.
One thing a little bit unusual here before we kind of throw open for questions and discussions. I would just ask Tommy to comment on any of this from the point of view of somebody who knows the American side of things so well. Did anything strike you as particularly familiar or shocking or?
No, not shocking. I mean, I think that what Dr. Gribben is talking about this constant tension about biblicism versus recourse to the Holy Spirit. I mean, it's definitely an issue that comes up in the 18th century, I mean, the Great Awakening in America and in England. I mean, there's some really exotic revelatory experiences that happen, and it always seems when it transfers into any kind of physical experiences of seeing things or smelling things or hearing things, that's when people get really nervous.
Yeah.
I mean, because they, they're okay if they say, with the eyes of my heart or something like that, I saw Jesus on the cross. They might get a little nervous, but that's basically okay. But if you say, with my bodily eyes, I saw, whatever, that seems like when the alarms go off. And, this is antinomianism, and so. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just there's something going on in Puritanism, and it's sort of evangelical descendant that people that know that there should be some kind of active role of the Holy Spirit, but they don't know what to do with that, and then I think you have similar kinds of dynamics about. The devil is doing things, but if you get too specific about what he's actually, or you try to cast him out, then you're often cast as being beyond the pale.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to say to that, or?
No, I think the 18th century parallels are quite striking, aren't they? Within the Baptists in the 1640s and 50s, you do get, I didn't speak about it now, but you do get quite a lot of women claiming prophetic gifts. And one of the ways in which women enter into public ministry within the Baptist communities is not as preachers of the word so much as preachers of experience. And of course, in the 18th century, that follows through into Joanna Southcott and all of these other interesting people as well. That's very helpful.
I also was struck by one thing, which was you mentioned the man who got associated with the French prophets. That's a very interesting movement. You have these people who are these very apocalyptic prophets who have basically been kicked out of Catholic France, and they're predicting these doomsday wars and so on, and they're associated with prophecies and signs and wonders. And that happens in 1712, which is an interesting date for a couple of reasons. But that probably does more than anything else to discredit enthusiastic religion in the 18th century. And in earlier times, people would have said, oh, what are these wonderful messages? And in 1712, the response is, you don't want a religion that ends up like these crazy people. And the other thing that happens in 1712, of course, is the last witch trial that ends up with somebody being executed in England. So it's almost as if enthusiastic religion and witchcraft end pretty much at the same time. They don't end, but they stop being away within respectable society. And so the French prophets are such a key turning point in England as well as Ireland, because they mark the shift to what you might loosely call modern British religion, of which is sometimes very rudely said that there are two. The famous remark about England is that there are two religions. There's Catholicism, which is wrong, and there's everything else which doesn't matter. It's sometimes said that there's sort of indifferentism, but 1712 really is a key turning point in that way.
Philip, if I can just add to that about the French prophets, the French prophet movement, kept on going, and just to connect a few dots here, I don't know if either of you know the story about Charles Wesley's encounter with one of the French prophets, where he ends up having to stay the night with this guy, and they were actually going to, as was common at the time, they were going to sleep in the same bed. Well, this French prophet guy, at some point, they're praying together, and he started speaking in tongues. Which that's another. I mean, that you've crossed a line. It's hard to find in the 18th century about people speaking in tongues, but and Charles Wesley had never come across this before And he said in his diary he began gobbling like a turkey cock. and
You sure it wasn't French he was speaking?
No, I think he was speaking Italian. And so Wesley was, I mean, he was really alarmed, and so he started, it wasn't a formal exorcism, but he started praying for the guy to be, freed from this demonic spirit.
Yeah.
And then, he still ended up spending the night at the guy's house. So I mean, that's a, instance too, where when would you get accused of, being open to demonic influence, speaking in tongues?
Whenever we write the history of Pentecostalism, we always associate it with the revival in Los Angeles in the early 20th century and so on. So much of what we think of as Pentecostal and Pentecostal movements, you can find so many precedents from Puritanism through evangelicalism, and speaking in tongues is one of them. By the way, speaking of movements who the Wesleys meet, there's a famous moment which John Wesley talks about in his diary when he meets ranters. And he has this theological debate, and there's a fascinating argument. And Wesley at one point says something which is the absolute knockdown argument, which is, so you're describing all these things you can get away with. All right, so I suppose you're saying that if you want to have sex with a woman without being married to her, that's okay. And that's the most ludicrous thing in the world. And the man says, yeah, well, okay, as long as she consents. which is interesting. But that's ranters like in the 1740s, 1750s, which they're not supposed to be there anymore. Rather like your Pentecostals, like your Glossolalia is not meant to be there.
Right.
Any questions for Dr. Gribben? He's raised so many interesting points there.
I just have a question. I'm doing two things that could be dangerous here. One, I'm going on memory, and two, I'm ranging well outside my field. But didn't John Butler argue in Awash in a Sea of Faith that the Christianization of, say, New England sort of stamped out superstition and magic and things like that and actually made it less spiritual? And if you did argue that, is there anything left of that argument?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak with accuracy at this moment about Butler in particular, but there is a literature in disenchantment, isn't there, and how that plays out. I think a lot of the a lot of the question simply, or I think a lot of the issue is about how you define what is the supernatural, and how you define what's to be expected and what isn't to be expected. I mean, Weber talks a lot about disenchantment theory, and from what I can recall, he finds this as a moment of the beginnings of rationalism. We're talking about the Enlightenment yesterday with some of the PhD students. But again, just as I'm thinking about continuations and trends, I think there is kind of a movement here that's the Joseph Glanville stuff in the later century is obviously the beginnings of some kind of enlightenment, or responding to that enlightenment rationalism. But it's just so striking, as Philip was saying, that the way they respond to the claims of rationalism is not by some kind of confessional orthodox argument, but actually by collecting some of the most exotic and spectacular of the unusual instances of the previous period. And actually what's so striking as well about Glanville and Baxter and their collections of ghost stories is how many of them come from Cromwellian Ireland or have a connection with the 1640s and 1650s. Levitations, appearances of things in the sky, ghosts, the ghost that points to the money under the hearth. I mean, all of these are stories that hark back to this particular period. And so it's something about this period in particular that literally haunts the claim to disenchantment and continually frustrates it. Popular culture in Ireland is quite a strange thing. My dad can remember speaking to the last man in his area who talked to the fairies. And so I think that a lot of these grand claims about great social trends towards disenchantment just don't take account of the very local circumstances in which non-scientific folkways, if that's the way you want to think of them, can be sustained over centuries when they would be implausible anywhere else.
And is it, my impression is that this approach that you're taking has grown considerably in the last 25 years or so. We're
Yeah.
uncovering more and more of this stuff that was maybe ignored by historians for a
Yeah.
time, who bought this sort of disenchantment argument.
Yeah, I mean, there's something like about 4 or 5 books now published on demonism and exorcism in the last 15 years, I think. You know, there's a trend now looking at this, quite a big literature now in exorcism and demonology all the way across early modern Europe. Quite what it amounts to, I'm not absolutely sure. This is a kind of a one-off project, really conceived of for today's event. So I can't speak about bigger trends in the scholarship, I think, with any confidence. But yeah, I think there's a lot still to be done. I think it's very striking, as Philip mentioned earlier on, that Henry Bowen's account is often read as an instance of atheism, because that's how his enemies present them. That it suits them rhetorically to present his claims as evidence of atheism, whereas in actual fact, atheism could there be a code word for any kind of non-normative religion, which in this case could be Quakerism, Ranterism, or worse. I've got a PhD student at home working on the Essex witch trials. We had Matthew Hopkins there, Witchfinder General, earlier on. But if you look at Hopkins and Stern, the two men who write about the Essex witch trials in the 1640s, what they're describing looks a lot like, the coven meetings that they describe looks a lot like prayer meetings for unorthodox or lay-led democratised forms of religion. So there's a lot going on, but it's a question of interpretation, isn't it?
In fact, if you want a direct sequence, there's a direct sequence from the charges that witches go off into the open fields to meet, and the origins of what becomes the field preaching tradition in Scotland, particularly under the Covenanters. And then that is passes over to the Methodists. So there's a bunch of poor people off praying in a field, can be read in lots of different ways. You know, is that field preaching or is that devil worship?
Yeah. I suppose one of the questions though is, what do they do with witnesses? How many of these claims can be witnessed by a third person? And how's that, I can ask a criminologist this question, whether in these trials that's ever brought into play as something which confirms claims to experience. An individual can make any kinds of a claim to experience. How do you adjudicate that? You don't know if it's right or wrong.
One of the classics, by the way, is, don't forget, England is always different from virtually any other European society because it has English law and it establishes truth claims by a different process of verification. Roman law countries like Scotland and to some extent Ireland have their own different rules. And one of the differences in Scotland has got this incredible tradition of witchcraft because you can go by confession. And sometimes that means getting involved in torture. And sometimes you meet these absolutely crazy people who come forward and confess the most extravagant things, and that gets believed. Whereas in England, they wouldn't do it. Virtually everything we know about Scottish witchcraft comes from one crazy lady in 1662. Isabel Goody.
You're assuming she wasn't being truthful in what she claimed?
Yeah, I've got a reasonable substance for that.
Well, can I ask a question based on this? Because I can ask this question in Baylor, I wouldn't dare ask at home. How do historians who do believe in the supernatural write about claims to the supernatural? So we work in a discipline, by and large, has an empirical basis for establishing truth claims. So what if you happen to be a person who believes in, for example, the resurrection, physical resurrection of Christ, and all of the stuff that goes along with that within, a conservative way of approaching Scripture? How do you bring that into discussions of, let's say, the 17th century, where individuals are making claims that you wouldn't want to stand up at the HA and say were plausible or true, but actually you have a sneaking suspicion that something might have been going on there? How do you do that? I would like advice.
I would refer to that specifically to Isabel Goody because you can see she's talking about things that you can't easily test and just are not true.
Right.
But the other supernatural one, it's very much the way you phrase it. Where that is an absolute pressing issue now is not historical. If you want to write about African religion today, if you want to write about religion in large parts of Christianity in large parts of Asia, you'd better take ideas like healing and witchcraft very seriously indeed.
Yes.
Because you may not believe them, but the people you're dealing with absolutely do believe them. And in fact, they use almost exactly the same arguments that you and I have been describing today. If we presented this to many Nigerian churches, they would sit there and say, yep, we had a case just like that last year.
Yeah.
My sense is, to answer your question, this is just my impression, that over the last 25 years, we've moved from a sort of attitude of everybody, secular historians, we know this didn't really happen, but let's talk about it, to now let's just bracket the question of whether it happened or not, because the people who are reporting this in bygone days, they believed it and they acted on it, and that's what's important.
Yeah.
And so the normative question just sort of gets bracketed, and we take the reports of it seriously. Yeah. And those of us who believe that that there are interventions within time, we talk about that at lunch. Not in an AA session.
You're out to lunch.
Yeah.
Out to lunch and miracles.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think Barry's right. That's the move that's been made. I mean, even by, secular historians, that there's a lot less inclination, I think, to kind of dismiss or say, well, this is some kind of psychological phenomenon that can't possibly, or to argue with. I mean, you certainly want to just let people sort of speak for themselves. Now, I mean, if there is patent evidence that this is fraudulent, or just not like this case you're talking about. I mean, that obviously, if you have evidence that suggests that nothing like this has happened, you bring that in too. But I think, it seems to me that, I can think of a couple of cases in the Great Awakening where there was one guy who had one of these just phenomenal visionary experiences. And what did it lead into? Well, he went from being just a kind of a nominal Christian farmer to 40 years as a pastor in Connecticut. Something happened to him that was pretty profound to him. I'm not sure I'm quite prepared to say that he saw everything that he said in a physical sense, but I mean, why would you argue with that? And an even more pointed issue was about a miraculous healing that I published about in the Great Awakening, where you have a woman who simply for 20 years she can't walk. I mean, she cannot walk, and she gets healed, and she's running around the room, right? And so you say, okay, did this happen or not? I mean, it's a little hard to argue that it simply didn't happen.
Sure.
And it's funny because the newspaper follow-ups, they would monitor her for 40 years on, and they would always say she can still walk. And so I mean, again, I don't think if you're writing for kind of a mixed audience, as far as you can't assume faith, or I mean even a kind of cessationist audience, the real Christians would be like, whoa, this is dubious, but why try to get in the way of that? And so I published this with William Marion Corley, and they did it in the first round. They sort of said, you almost sound like an apologist for this. And well, I guess I probably am. But that didn't get in the way of it getting published. So I thought that was an example where I think in secular academia there's not necessarily hostility towards this kind of thing anymore.
Sure. I think about your instance there of someone making a claim that's obviously false. The Essex witch trials, a number of the witches who give evidence say they've got familiars, small animals who come along, they pet them, they suckle them and so forth. And witnesses do see them, or they report that they've seen them. And sometimes large groups of witnesses see things or report things. I think it's a very interesting and quite complex social phenomena of the way in which people create realities and then sustain those realities rhetorically.
It is, and one question I always have is, where did this happen? And what I mean by that is, if it happened in Scotland or France, almost certainly those statements from witnesses were got out under systems of basically intimidation and threat. In England, it's much more a case of people do get together and say these things. There's nothing like the same element of physical threat against witnesses. Very, very important distinction. And I've done a lot of stuff through the years on modern day child abuse cases involving charges of Satanism and ritual abuse. And you get exactly the same argument there. And the simple question I always have is, tell me the means by which these statements were produced, and I'll tell you whether or not I find them credible. But you do raise absolutely critical questions of evidence. And, the best book I know offhand, which actually deals with some of these, is Ronald Hutton's recent one on The Witch.
Oh yeah.
Which is a splendid cross-cultural study of witchcraft in many different societies, including contemporary Africa and so on. Such a good book.
Yes.
I'm interested if you could draw a line between the depictions of the supernatural, made tangible in terms of these demons and devils and stuff, and the way that indigenous peoples of the Americas were described as devils or hellish fiends and that sort of thing. Because it seems as though they're using the same language and they're kind of describing these adversaries, right? But one of them is in a very kind of tangible, real person form, and another one is in the idea of a supernatural made tangible. I'm just curious if you can draw a line between those uses of the image.
Yeah, I'm not sure. The language of monstrosity or the demonological references, they're there in Ireland as well, as I was mentioning in some instances, but where native populations are referred to in these kinds of terms. So what's happening there? Maybe it's simply rhetoric.
Yeah.
I think, I know the North American context much less well than the British and Irish context, but certainly in Ireland, one of the things that's key, I think, to the language of description of native populations is the sense of that their religion is real and that their religion subjects them to the Antichrist. So they're literally the subjects of the Antichrist, populating in an overwhelming way an island in which the exponents of the true gospel have a tiny foothold. And that sense of threat leads towards this kind of language. In North America, I suppose it's different as well because certainly in the early years of European colonisation, the impact of Christianity is quite limited from what I understand. And that many of, as the frontier advances, it's advancing into populations that really know very little about Christian truth claims. And so there's an anthropological aspect to this as well. What is this religion that's being practiced here? How do we understand that? And I suppose then the identification of the worshipper with the worshipped leads to the demonological language, but I'm absolutely no expert in this. It's just I'm thinking out loud as I respond to that. Do you have something in mind?
No, it's just I was thinking it's interesting that the description of Native peoples in these terms and almost a kind of a very real belief that they are being used by God as adversaries.
This isn't on TV, is it?
No. But there's an interesting connection in my mind that I'm trying to play out between the acceptance of a physical person as demonic, as a devil, and the resistance to the idea of a spiritual demon made tangible.
So what are they claiming then? Are they claiming the human individual is a demon incarnate, or that they are demonized in some way?
Well, so I'm thinking particularly of some of the kind of the early Virginian descriptions of them being. I mean, they say they are like fiends from hell.
Mhm.
And so they're described in ways that seem to be evocative of demonic imagery.
Yeah.
But there are some accounts that almost kind of put forth the belief that that God is using Native Americans and other indigenous groups in the same way that he would use demons in the Old Testament
Okay.
as kind of adversaries to
Okay.
people.
I wonder if there's something there just about the wilderness kind of imagery that's often used to associate or to
Yeah.
describe the land. But biblically, the wilderness is the howling wilderness is an expression you often come across, isn't it, in early American writing?
Sure.
But also the wilderness is a place where is literally the haunt of demons in a number of Old Testament passages as well.
Yeah.
So perhaps it's just a discursive trope that if you've got a wilderness, you've got to have the demons that inhabit it.
Sure.
I don't mean to reduce everything to language games, but I do think that biblical references, the construction of a world through biblical allusion, does mean you want to populate that world in an almost allegorical fashion, where individuals are given certain kinds of status or function, because you've got to find the corresponding feature from what you read in Scripture. But I don't know. It's an interesting question.
If I may, I will come to an end at that moment. I'll just say thank you very much to Dr. Gribben
Well,
for
thanks for the invitation.
presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.